My name is Kolvin Stone, and I'm a partner and head of technology at Fox Williams. And today's webinar is the latest in our Disruptive Tech series, where we're going to focus on growing pains for legal teams in fast growth companies. So in the UK, we've witnessed significant growth in terms of the in-house legal function at fast growth tech companies, I think, which is really replicating what has been happening in the US for a long time now, especially in Silicon Valley. In the US, it's quite common for companies to appoint their first in-house lawyer at or around Series A. And that is now becoming the case in the UK, especially in regulated sectors such as financial services. So the role of the in-house lawyer has therefore started to track the journey of the founding team. Much is written about the transition from founder to CEO, but far less reported is the transition, or far less talked about, is the transition that the in-house legal team needs to undertake from startup to scale up to mature company. But fortunately, we have an illustrious and expert panel with us today to help us unpick this journey from the lawyer's perspective and just give some insights from their own experiences. So first, we've got James Sullivan, who is Chief Legal Officer at Ziglu. Ziglu is in the process of raising its Series A, so he's just about to do the journey all over again. James was previously head of legal at Monzo during a period of considerable growth. Sam Ross, who is General Counsel at Remote, he's recently joined, and previously Sam was General Counsel at ComplyAdvantage and also WorldRemit, where he was WorldRemit's first lawyer and built the legal team from up to 8 people as the company grew from 200 to 800 staff globally, and also went through a number of funding rounds. Stephanie Wallace, who was recently appointed General Counsel of Metro Bank. Congratulations, Stephanie. And she was previously head of legal at RateSetter and supported the company through numerous funding rounds, totaling £40 million and an exit to Metro Bank. So in terms of, if you want to pose any questions, feel free to do that through the Q&A functionality that you should see that on your screens. I will try and deal with them as we go, and hopefully, if we have some time at the end, we can pose some questions. So let's get into the Q&A. Firstly, James. So how would you describe the role of a sole lawyer at a tech company that's experiencing rapid growth? And in that role, are there any kind of experiences, tips that you can share in terms of how to deal with some of those challenges of being a sole in-house lawyer?
Yes. So I think the biggest thing that's different, I think, to previous roles I've done in other organizations that are more mature is just the pace. The work is very varied, but the pace is much faster. And I used to sort of joke at, Monzo, if you weren't in the room and something was discussed, probably be done and out the door before you even realised it was happening. So because the pace of change is very high, the people are constantly changing, the business is changing, products are changing, and that means that the expectations on the GC, I think, are a little bit different. And you need to keep up, but ideally you need to stay ahead. And then I think the other kind of key difference relative to more mature organizations is the risk appetite is very high. Mm-hmm. And I think from a GC perspective, that can be a little bit uncomfortable if you've never experienced that before, because you think, however commercial you think you are as a GC, being in a sort of fast scale up will stretch that, and you will be expected to take a lot more risk and take a more pragmatic view on things than you've ever done before, and that really just has to shape how you interact with the business and how you give service, how you service the business. So I think one of the tips, my first tip would be, in order to get used to that high risk appetite, you need to understand it a little bit better. So you really need to kind of get into the nitty gritty of the business and really in your mind kind of sense what's within risk appetite and what's not. And that is actually quite hard to do. And you have to kind of see the business in action, I think, in order to kind of get that intangible understanding. Because if you start giving advice or recommendations that mean that the business is working below risk appetite, you won't be particularly popular. But you've also got to be the GC. So sometimes you've got to kind of set where the boundaries are and say, actually, that feels risky or outside risk appetite. Really, let's explore what that risk looks like and like how material it is, and then maybe kind of start a conversation. I think the other kind of consideration, I think, being in a startup or maturing business is you've got to really think about where you can make the most impact. There is a ton of things that you do, particularly if you're first into the role. There'll be a ton of things that you feel that you need to do. There'll be probably a few fires here and there. People will be demanding that you help them with this and that, and that's great. Obviously, you've got to service the business and keep people happy, but you've also got to think about not just being reactive to everything that's going on, but step back and actually think about what the business actually needs that they haven't actually even realized that they need or identified that they need. So really take the time to step back and understand the business, understand the drivers, and then think about the things that are missing, the things that you want to put in place that will make the most impact in the longer term.
Interesting. So I think a lot of that, what I'm hearing is that what's key in that role is to really, really understand the business, both from a kind of risk perspective, and in terms of trying to manage priorities. How did you do that? How did you sort of embed yourself in the organization, whether it be the engineering team or the product team? How did you do that?
So I'd say it does help being part of the C-suite, because you actually get to hear all the conversations from the top down. And I think that's probably where you get the sense of risk appetite. It's probably not across the organization. It really is set from the top. And I think you do have to give yourself maybe 3 months or so to kind of really understand where that risk tolerance lies, just from the way the business operates, the speed at which it operates, its processes as well. And I guess what I've tried to do as well is create a bit more structure around how decisions get made. So it's great risk accepting things, but make sure that you've actually framed what risk you're accepting and make sure that you're making the right decision with the right people in the room. But I think ultimately it is about making sure that you've got lots of face time with the right people, that you're understanding how the business operates, who are the real key decision makers, how do decisions get made, what are the things that the business cares about, what are the things that the board cares about, and then just start to map out in your mind what does risk look like for that organization. It's if you're spending your time focusing on immaterial points in a contract, you're not really going to make much impact.
Great. Sam, from your experience, how did you kind of see the role as, you're the first lawyer at WorldRemit? How did you see that role, and how did you sort of deal with some of the challenges?
Yeah, so some similar themes to James. I guess when I came into WorldRemit, I was still relatively junior. I'd just come from an environment where I'd been part of a 1,000-lawyer team at Barclays, where there wasn't a lot of individual decision-making capability. There was the opportunity to kind of showcase your talents and impact certain projects, but certainly not being a part of a decision-making team, which is more akin to the kind of roles that I'd say James, Stephanie, and I are in now. So I think each situation is different, and conversations like who you're reporting to, who your key stakeholders it's really worth thinking about that, and how to make the best of those situations. So I was very lucky in that when I came into WorldRemit, I was under the wing of an experienced CFO, and so I deferred a lot to him, because we trusted each other, and he gave me quite a lot of advice on how to best make an impact in the organization. So it was actually less about the CEO at the time, because I didn't have a reporting line into him, and I would get messages sort of secondhand about what his priorities were and what his focus areas were. So the CEO and I developed a relationship that was not strictly sort of project related. It was more, we got to know each other as people. And I think that's important as well. So if you have the opportunity to develop relationships with senior stakeholders, even though you might not be directly reporting to them, I'd say take those opportunities, get to know people across the organization, not just the senior people, the junior people as well. Find out what they do in their team. So James said, learn about the business, but also learn about the core aspects of what people are doing in their roles. So I remember an hour where I sat down with one of the data team, and he explained to me what SQL was and how you get information for data reporting purposes out of a database, because I had no idea how that worked. And again, Ishmael, the CEO of WorldRemit, we would sit in his office and he would tell me about his previous career and things that he'd experienced. And it was nothing really to do with the day-to-day priorities, but it was just basically building up a reputation and a network inside of the company, which later proved very, very useful. So I think, it's important to assess the particular circumstances around your arrival, not try to push for stuff that you don't have because of the selfish reasons. I need this promotion, or I need this reporting line to change immediately. There is a time for that, and there is a place for that if it makes complete business sense to make organizational changes. But the timing of those discussions is important, and I'd say it's more important to just build up yourself within the organization at the right pace and in a sort of considered, respectful way, because that's part of being a general counsel. It's not about thrashing around and trying to make change for change's sake.
Understood. Just a question that has come in. So I'll just read it. Totally agree with the pace comment for tech companies and the churn. Any top tips on spreading self-service across the organization against this backdrop? James, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I think it's part of a broader piece, which is about understanding what the role of the legal function is. And you can very easily just become a kind of servant to the business. And to some extent, certainly if you're first in role, you might need to do a little bit of that, but that's not sustainable in the long term. So setting up the tools to enable the business to self-serve is really, really critical. And you can start on a really basic level, right? You can just have a standard NDA. Everyone knows where it is, and they can go straight there and put it off, rather than every time they need an NDA, they message you saying, "Can I have the NDA?" Right? That's kind of rule one. But think about what are the common requests that you're getting across the organization, and then try and solve them once holistically, rather than kind of solving the problem time and time again. Then there's a different question around where you put these tools for the business to self-serve, and obviously that a lot of GCs will look at tech solutions to do that. I don't think you necessarily need to go and buy a solution. You can look at what solutions already exist in the business and try and use those in a way that the business can easily understand, rather than telling them they need to kind of buy a new tech tool and then they've got to access everything from that tool. Yeah,
I've heard in-house we're starting to use AI in terms of automatic chat box. To deal with some sort of routine queries. Is there anything, Stephanie, you use to sort of manage, the multiple requests that you get on a daily basis for assistance?
Well, it's funny to say that. It's something we're looking at the minute at the bank. At RateSetter, we were never quite big enough or at the maturity stage of that. We were more in the servants to the business phase, I suppose. But yeah, I think everything the others have said resonates with me in terms of the challenge from the IT department. You might think, oh, we'll buy some of this legal tech, it's very exciting, it's going to solve all our problems, but actually you need to get over the hurdle of how are we going to implement this. And to be honest, in most fintech companies, the technologists are not going to have much interest in something they consider inferior from a technology perspective, and certainly inferior in terms of their priority list, vast priority list of things they need to implement that are business critical. So yeah, I think it's more about seeing what you can do, how you can be effective in terms of relationships, and just socializing any ideas you've come up with in terms of precedents, sort of doing some training around the business on how to use that so that people are actually using it, rather than just you've done all the work doing it and then people are still coming to you saying, where's the NDA?
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what it's like at the kind of startup phase, and then, you know, typical journey, one hopes, is that you sort of move into the sort of, I guess, sort of scale up. Like, where do you see that? And this is for you, Stephanie. Where do you see the inflection point in terms of the change from startup to scale up, and then how do you see the kind of legal role, you know, changing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think it's actually, when you're in it, it's quite hard to tell sort of, oh, this has happened, we're now scale up, not startup. Yeah, I think certainly at RateSetter it happened over a couple of years, I would say. But when you go from the, you know, startup phase where the business is trying all kinds of different ideas, and it's a kind of, you know, very high risk appetite, not so worried about you know, the longevity or the sustainability of certain decisions that are being made. And then there comes a point, particularly in the regulated sphere, where there is usually, in my experience, some sort of wake-up call, generally from an external factor, such as one of the regulators, where there's a realization that, oh, we can't operate in the way we used to. We've got to do things differently. Right. We need to make ourselves fit for scaling up. And that generally tends to be accompanied by a kind of rationalization of the business, what the business is about, how it's interacting with its regulators, and it sort of grows up. And you get a sense of that around the business, but I think it's very difficult to put your finger on a particular event happening. You know, obviously, if you're going through certain types of funding round, then you might find yourself with external investors who have certain expectations, so that will obviously bring things on. But yeah, I think you become aware of it, and certainly at RateSetter it was something where the legal team needed to evolve to help the business to keep up with those changing circumstances. You start to move less from somebody that the business comes to with their tail between their legs at the last minute because they realise they need to get legal, I suppose, grudgingly to check something, to actually being more part. You've hopefully got to a stage where you're part of the business, you're seen as a trusted advisor that's going to help them. They recognise they need you to get to where they want to get to grow the business in a sustainable way.
It's interesting you say about, you know, often there's an event, it might be external, and we had a couple of in-house lawyers from senior lawyers from Facebook and Google about 10 months ago. And the person at Facebook said the moment everything changed was Cambridge Analytica, and that was it then. Complete change of culture. Suddenly it was all about getting legal involved at the various early stage, certainly in terms of, you know, kind of product development. But they, you know, she could point to a moment in time when everything changed. What about you, James? What's your experience in terms of that transition, and how then your role needs to adapt as a lawyer? It sounds like there is less of a risk appetite, so I guess you need to start changing your advice. Maybe it's less fast paced as well. But what was your experience?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I joined Monzo, it was definitely going through that transition. I completely agree with Stephanie. Often there are things which drive you in that direction. So funding rounds, regulatory requirements, more governance. Maybe that you've got kind of more formal board and board committees. That starts to create a lot more structure and a lot more work as a result of that. But I also think that there is a point when you need more specialist experience in the team. So, I think when you're hiring initially, you want generalists. So you want people that you can apply themselves to lots of different problems. But I think over time, as you mature, suddenly you realize that you've got this one recurring issue that, you need specialist advice, and you're spending a lot going externally, and actually somewhat you could save some cost and do it better if you had it internal. So I think that's another factor which drives that. And so I suppose that has an impact on the team. So you're going to go from a team that is sort of throwing themselves on lots of different problems, and suddenly you've got more structure in the team where their roles are perhaps narrower. So they're more specialists in their narrow roles, and someone previously who was doing a range of different things is now maybe just doing one of those things, and that definitely can be a positive for some people that want to focus on those things, and for others it is challenging because they don't have the broad visibility and impact that they across the business that they once had. I think from a GC perspective, I think it's really interesting when you go through these inflection points, because you're somewhat helping the business make that transition as well. It's not like one day you're early stage, next day late stage, right? There is a transition, and there's lots of pain points in that transition. I think one of the things you've got to be able to do is kind of increasingly put more structure, in the function and how you interact with the business. The basic things like the way you save things, the way you record the information. It's not okay just to for someone to throw out some advice and it goes lost in the ether. It solves a problem at a particular point in time, but no one could reuse it in future. So you start needing to think about how you use that, how you save that information in a way that can be replicated. How can you access that? How you retain that know-how? And that sounds easier said than done, because everyone is super busy and just trying to get the job done and solve problems for the here and now. Very few people are really focused on, great, well, what do I do now to make the business better in 1 year's time? Obviously, they feel that they are, but everyone's just too busy to think that. I think your role as a GC is to step back and think about how you change the way the team operates, and how change the way that the team operates internally, but also its interaction with the business in order to drive that change. And that is really, really hard, because lawyers are not the best change agents in my experience. They like to do things in a certain way, and to then kind of take them on a journey of doing things in a different way. Even in-house counsel who are perhaps a bit more tech savvy can be difficult.
Yeah, I can see that. So just another question from the audience. I'll just read it. How have you adapted your communication style to work with business in a fast growth environment? So I guess it's particularly relevant if you're coming from, Barclays, Sam. You're in one environment and then suddenly you're in a completely different environment. How did you sort of change your communication style?
Yeah, there's definitely a journey associated with that for lawyers, because when you're training in a law firm, I think you're taught that more detail is necessary, particularly as the pieces of work you're being asked to do are kind of memoranda of advice. You're involved in quite formal processes like litigation and corporate deals, where there's a need to be very comprehensive with all of the information that's flowing back and forth. Mm-hmm. And those key moments when you communicate are emails or even letters that are checked by 3 or 4 different people when you're part of that process. Whereas when you're in this new environment of a fast growth tech company, messages are flying around on Slack. We actually don't use any WhatsApp messages at Remote, which I think is a really, really good move. Lots of fast growth tech companies bridge this sort of work communication and non-work communication. I know the UK government have even done this a lot, but I like the fact that we actually keep everything on work systems. But nevertheless, Slack, direct messages, Slack groups, where a lot of decisions get made and a lot of things are discussed. So in that kind of messaging, it's even more important to be brief and to be to the point. And sometimes the stakeholders will want to understand the why as well as the advice. So I think it's basically the rule that I always follow is tell them what. So say, this is the advice, this is the suggested way forward. If you want to do any more reading on this, here's a link to, we use Notion. So Notion, basically a very, very fancy intranet. Here's a link to a Notion page where the team has listed more information on this issue, including the kind of legal analysis. So the communication you have to be able to be sort of decisive and clear on the communication. So recommending a way forward or communicating what the plan of action is. One of those two things I think is really important, rather than a communication that basically doesn't advance the conversation on anymore. That's not really tolerated. And I've sort of learned that the hard way, because I have communicated that way by just having a chat about an issue, and it just doesn't really fly in a fast-paced environment. You have to add some value to that communication and that conversation. Last thing I'd say is, one thing that we found very useful at Remote is recording videos. Like, we use Loom, and Slack now has video recording enabled as well. So if you want to explain something to people in the company or record a message, that can be a really good way of communicating. If you're not sort of in an office and you don't have a chance to be part of an all hands meeting, you're not coming up in an all hands meeting for a couple of months, recording something and sending it out is quite a cool new way of communicating with people, and it's a bit more dynamic than writing something down.
Yeah. How did you you sort of mentioned sort of private, the sort of transition from private practice to in-house, and often in private practice, I think you get better at this as you get older, more experienced. But lawyers are quite kind of risk averse and don't like to give a firm recommendation, and they're also looking at their own position. How did you feel that? Do you feel that pressure as an in-house counsel when someone is asking you for your view? Do you feel the same? Do you get more comfortable essentially being very firm about what your approach is, because that's the way that you add value?
I think so long as you're really clear about what the downsides are to your recommended approach, and that you've researched what the worst thing that could happen is, then it gives you a lot more comfort. So it is not very smart to say, I recommend we go with this because here are the benefits, but don't, not also caveat it with, here's what could go wrong, here's the potential legal consequences, and here's our best understanding of how that has played out in practice in similar situations. So there will always remain that need to call out the risks, because that's a really important aspect of the legal role. But as James was saying earlier, there's a risk appetite that exists in the organization. You have to really respect that, play along with it, apart from situations where something is clearly illegal and people don't understand that. So you have to communicate that and say, we cannot do this. I cannot allow this to happen, which you will have to do 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Or something is deeply unethical and people are not really understanding your view on why it's unethical, and then that's the challenge is on you to explain that in a way that people understand. And then there may be on the ethical side, there may be a debate back and forth on it, because maybe there's something that you as the lawyer haven't considered and someone else in the business has a better understanding of. So it's not straightforward, but those are the sorts of things that I think about.
And Stephanie, what's your view in terms of how you've had to adapt your your communication style, I guess, mainly focusing on as the business changes and perhaps the sort of risk appetite changes?
Yeah, I think obviously what Sam has just said still rings true, but I think that there's perhaps more of an element on the focus as shifts from, you can't do that because here are all the terrible risks of doing that, because you have the risk appetite is so high that you kind of have to really lay it on thick in order to stop them doing something terrible. You move to a more open, you understand what the business is trying to achieve. And I think, you hopefully you're more comfortable in being able to be quite honest with them and to kind of embrace what stage the risk appetite is at for the business at that particular point in time. So I think it's a more honest and open conversation. So you can say, look, I'm comfortable with this risk. These are the downsides, but I think it's worth doing given what we're trying to achieve, as opposed to know that you can't even entertain that. So yeah, it's just more of a conversation, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Sam, just coming back to you again, and I'm going to link this to a question that we've had. So talking about this transition, startup to scale up, often at this point, also tech companies in particular are starting to think international expansion and moving into other markets. It's obviously easy with tech, it's being borderless, more difficult, I think, if you're in a regulated environment. But how did you kind of manage that kind of growth, and how did your role change? And particularly there is a sort of question here around how you structure legal teams when you potentially got your teams dotted around the world, and how that works. I know you had some experience with that at WorldRemit.
Yeah, and even more so now in this new role, because I'm having to train myself that the English law answer is not necessarily the answer. And in our company, we're lucky enough to have English as our language that we speak across the world, and I'm really grateful for that, because many of my colleagues have had to not just learn English, but learn business English, to be able to have the opportunity to work in an international company. So so we communicate in English. I've got a background in English law, but the service that we're providing is provided in all sorts of different countries, where definitely there are some key differences in the way that the legal system is set out, and the specific employment law issues that relate to our business. So in this role, I've arrived to find out that there's just an absolute spider's web of relationships between us and loads of different external law firms, and some of the law firms are advising business units directly without going through the legal team. And in some of the cases, there's more of a more traditional kind of instruction taking place from the legal team to the external law firms. And I'm still going through the process of trying to achieve some kind of consistency with how we're doing that work. But I guess a short answer is that there'll be some areas where you can take a bit of a risk, and you can apply some common sense to unlocking problems. And you can say, well, despite the fact that this relates to an international situation, we're still going to go ahead based on our standard way of doing things. And then sometimes an issue comes across your desk where you think, well, no, we really need to check this point with a local lawyer. And in those cases, it's really important to position it as, this is the standard way that we do things. Is there anything in your legal framework or your system that conflicts with this? And if so, what do we need to do to fix it? Because if you do it the other way around, you slow things down 10, 20, 30 times, and you end up getting a load of very, very jurisdiction specific advice that doesn't really take into account the fact that it's an international business, and there are multiple jurisdictions involved in the delivery of the service. So it's really, really tricky when you're talking about this, and there are sort of certain degrees of risk that you need to take in order to have a more standardized approach to providing the service. That's certainly the case at remote. WorldRemit, I think, similar type thing, because ultimately, we're unapologetically offering a global solution. Right. So you have to be very mindful of the local laws and the mandatory local considerations, but at the same time, you have to push the boundaries a little bit to try and achieve that that standardized way of doing things.
Yeah, no, completely. It's a sort of perennial problem, and there's a continual tension between offering that standardizing operations, trying to offer a global service, and recognizing that, you know, different jurisdictions have different rules. So Stephanie, James, anything to add from you know, how your kind of role changes once the company starts to expand into new markets, and kind of how you dealt with that?
I can pick up. Yeah, I mean, I think it does depend on the seniority of the person that you're hiring as well. So obviously, if you're hiring a sort of local GC level, then, you know, that person's going to want to own that territory and all things related to that, and it may impact reporting lines as well. I think what you want to try and do is not make it all about the reporting line, but a lot of the way I've seen this done in other functions like engineering is you have this difference between reporting line and discipline. So you might be allocated within another function, and you might actually have a functional reporting line for a delivery of something, but you actually sit within a discipline of engineering, or in this case legal, and so you still have a legal team even if you don't have the same reporting lines, and that enables you to share information, make sure that you're giving advice consistently to the business, that you've got a broader perspective. I think particularly for maybe a sole counsel in another jurisdiction who may feel a bit more remote to the kind of the hub, if assuming the hub's in the UK.
Yeah,
that would be my recommendation.
Stephanie?
I was going to say, I did, having only rate setter and Metro Bank are UK only, so luckily we've not really had to deal too much with that as yet, but we'll see. I've listened with interest to the tips on what to do if we suddenly do decide to expand into global domination.
Okay, right, let's just a couple of questions that we can deal with. I'll just read it. James talks about taking a step back and what will make the impact in the long term, which they completely understand. Any tips and advice about how you effectively find the time and space to do this when you have the continual everyday urgency getting in the way?
It's a bit of a facile answer, but you do need to make the time. So you do need to like put a slot in your diary for if you are being reactive. I mean, I certainly put blocks in my diary. Just sometimes I look at my calendar and it's just booked out back to back because other people are pulling you into meetings. So I think you definitely need to block the time, and just don't underestimate the time to self-reflect, going for a walk, getting yourself away from your day-to-day to just reflect on things is really, really important. Yeah, so I don't have a complete answer to that other than take some time for yourself.
Definitely.
And I would agree. I think we all wry smiles at that one, because there is no easy answer, and it is always the perennial challenge, I suppose, is how to take the time out of the day-to-day firefighting role. And I think the only way I manage to do it is blocking chunks out in my diary, and even then it's just the culture we are in at the moment is very, and particularly when people are coming back to the office or remote full-time, there is more of a tendency, I found, if other people would disagree, to just put meetings in back to back. Unless you put those chunks of time in yourself, you will find yourself without a minute to spare in every day. So I think apart from anything, it's important just for your own sanity to do that.
I can practice what we preach there, because I'm actually in my tennis gear at the moment, and I'm about to go and play tennis with our VP Lifecycle Ops, because why not? Let's go and play tennis for an hour, and then we can chat about work challenges that we're working on together, and then I'll come home and do some more work. Why not?
Because I guess you have to do that, right? As I think James was saying, that you need to have a vision of where the company is going, and ultimately what skill sets you might need. So if you're getting questions relating to privacy, I'm looking at my own area now, then that maybe is time to think about getting a privacy lawyer, particularly if you're spending a lot of money on outside counsel. But Sam, perhaps you can answer this question from one of our members in the audience, which is kind of related. How would you deal with a senior lawyer who was responsible for everything, and now you want them to be specialist? And they don't agree. So how would you try and convince them that this is in the interest of the business? Because a lot of people like being in at the early stage because it is generalist and it's very, very, very varied. And then obviously over a period of time, you need more specialist expertise. So how do you make that transition, or convince someone to make that transition for you?
I think by the time you've got to a point where you want them to do something, you've already got a problem. So ideally, taking a step back, you would have had set in place a relationship with the person from day one, where there was the understanding that you would communicate openly about two areas. The first area being their career aspirations, what they're looking to get out of the job for the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years. And be as open about that as possible from day one, even extending to what do you want to do after this? Do you want to move somewhere else to become a head of legal? Are you seeing yourself moving out of legal? Whatever it might be, as open as possible. And then I'm also very open with my direct reports and people that work in my teams about my own career ambitions, because I find that really breeds a more transparent relationship. And then on the second hand, there's the need to both realize that the reason that we're in these roles is because we work for a business and we do that for our customers. And that is the most important thing. So if you can't have a career, if you're thinking about things in that space of me, my job, my needs, and you're not also thinking about what's the business's needs, what's the client's needs, what's the customer's needs, then I don't think you're in a very good place. So any conversation involving that, I think, needs to really include both of those elements, and you can achieve compromises that tick boxes in both your own career development and the needs of the business. And you can do it in a measured, transparent way. And you hopefully don't have to get to that point where it's the 9th of November and you say, I've suddenly made this decision that you need to completely change everything and do something else. Hopefully it's more fluid than that. I personally haven't had to deal with such a sort of stark transition like that. So hopefully it won't ever happen.
Yeah, that I think leads us neatly on to the next question, which is, we see in terms of that the journey, startup, scale up to mature company, often you see the same legal team, general counsel in place during the startup to scale up phase. But I think it's probably less common when you get into the mature phase, post IPO or post acquisition, which somewhat also reflects the natural evolution from CEOs who often transition out of the role at this sort of mature stage. Doesn't always happen, but probably more often than not. So in that scenario, how would you see the legal function, the GC role, needing to adapt to prevent that happening? If someone wanted to stay in that role, once you're in that kind of mature phase, how would you see them adapting? Assuming they wanted to stay, it might not be for everyone, but how do you see that working? And maybe I'll start with James.
Yeah, so it's a tricky one, because I think ultimately, it's picking up on Sam's point, it applies equally to the GC as anyone else, and the business as it grows needs different things from different people, and that applies to GC and C-suite, right? That's why the business make changes. So I think you've also got to be humble enough to accept that that could happen and that could change. But if you want to try and hang on in there as long as possible, or at least demonstrate that you're the person for the long haul, I think that the one thing that you can be starting to do is obviously making an impact, day to day, of course, and interacting, with across the business, so people know who you are and they understand, what the value that you deliver. But the thing that you can do different, I think, is start to think about like some of the long-term plans of the business and start planning things and having things in the back pocket. So, for example, if you think you're in a late stage and an IPO is a possibility, even if it's 20%, you can actually start to have conversations with external counsel, free ones, obviously, about what that might look like, and just start to map out, in your mind, gradually build up a document about like, what an IPO structure would look like, what the project plan would be, some of the things that would need to be put in place in order to take you on that journey, effectively some kind of gap analysis. Or if you think that you're going to be, it's going to be a trade sale or, a huge funding rounds, just start to plan those things so that when those conversations start happening, you can go, hey, and well, actually, I've been thinking about this for several months, and here are some of my ideas. I think if you just demonstrate that forward-looking mindset, I definitely think that helps. Also, it just shows that you're not reacting to the work that's coming across your desk. You're being a GC.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything particular to add to what James has just said, really, in terms of it's not the easiest situation. Everyone's human. I think just being able to demonstrate that I don't think it's a bad thing to show that it applies to the GC just as equally as anybody else in the team. Sometimes it helps, to earlier points we've already made, that opening up conversation, and sometimes I think the leader does have to go first. So yeah, I don't really have any other personal wisdom on that.
How did you find your, you've just been appointed to the GC role at Metro Bank. How did you find that transition? What was different from being head of legal at RateSetter to now Metro Bank, which I'm assuming is, a more mature environment?
Well, in many ways, I've actually been noticing the similarities more than the differences. I mean, obviously, It's a much bigger organisation. It's a public company. It's dual regulated as a bank rather than solo regulated by the FCA. So there are those extra challenges that come with that. But it's actually the same age company as RateSetter. And actually, a lot of the time when I've made assumptions, which is obviously the first place where you fall down is when you make assumptions, about how mature or what processes might be in place. I'm often surprised that actually it's not that dissimilar. I think companies just have to go on a corporate maturity journey, for want of a better word, and by a certain age, if it, depending on the amount of funding and all the rest of it, external input that's been taken on board, means that the company is not in that dissimilar place in terms of the processes and governance and the touch points for legal, really, I think are different. I mean, are very similar, but the thing that struck me is that whereas at RateSetter, I had got to a point where the legal function was sort of the trusted advisor, was being involved at the beginning of things. I think that point is still to come, and that's something I'm keen to do at Metro, is to make sure that the value of legal is understood and why it needs to be brought in at an early stage. And I think that's a battle I've got to have for the second time.
No, but I think it sounds again like a continual one. I mean, what I generally found in the sort of large and more mature environments is the structures, the structure of the legal team starts to change, in that rather than it being a central function, you start to put lawyers, product counselling lawyers into certain teams, so they get closer to the business, so that they are embedded in the sort of in the business teams, and they get more involved at an earlier stage. Is that the sort of structure that you have at the moment?
I think definitely
start to implement.
Yeah, I think the business partnering model is definitely an interesting one. And I think that's sort of, in part, that's what we've got now, but because of, I think, frankly, we're under-resourced in the legal team at the moment, and that means that we're just not able to service the business as effectively as I would like with that model at the moment. So inevitably, there's more of the generalism needs to happen before, in my view, we can revisit business partnering in that way. I think otherwise we're leaving too much of the business unsupported. I think it's quite, that's a position, a luxury position to be in, I think, to be able to do that. But yes, I think there's definitely, that is an effective way forward to help with that transition and to really embed legal within the business. But at the moment, I think my priority is to embed the culture of coming to legal more widely, and I think we just need to have bodies on the ground, so to speak, to do that.
Sam, I think Sam, from your perspective.
Yeah, I think you've seen this idea of shifting different parts of the business around to give more ownership of issues to different departments, and then those, or verticals, and then those verticals contain all the resources that they possibly need to be able to execute on their tasks. And it's a very nice sort of compelling argument. And to be honest, I don't think it really matters as long as everybody's clear about what they have to do and what they're working on. And what I say to lawyers in the team is, are you adding value every day to the company? And that's a decision that you need to take yourself and answer yourself. And if you're not, then speak up and let's do something about it. I think one of the key points about working in a scale up is that everybody, regardless of their rank, is kind of responsible for their own destiny and can make a suggestion or enact change if they come up with a good idea. It genuinely happens every week. I see examples of people doing that. So it's a very empowering environment to be in that sense, that you may feel stuck, but if you are enterprising enough to suggest a solution to a problem, or work together with a group of people to suggest a solution, then things can change very, very quickly. And yeah, that answer applies to smaller things than, entire teams shifting their reporting lines. But it's if you've got that spirit and that environment, then it makes everything a bit easier.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Sam. Just to take a question from the audience. So I've heard the general rule that you should aim to have one lawyer per 100, 150 employees in the company. Does that ring true to you? Again, any tips on trying to look forwards when considering your legal resource requirements when budgeting in a rapidly scaling environment? So sort of two related questions there. James, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to come up with a metric because I think it really depends on the type of business you are. If you're in a regulated business, then I think it's probably going to be lower than that. I think it's also about the number of products that you have, and also your roadmap for how many products you actually want to deliver over coming months, and the geographies in which you're currently based and which you're planning to be based in within, say, the 12 to 18 month window. I think the trouble with trying to get headcount is a lot of what lawyers do is invisible, because it's not just about reviewing docs. It's often about understanding and giving advice across the business, speaking to people, guiding them on the right path, and giving them information, and a lot of that can be pretty intangible. So the challenge, I think, on legal resourcing is like, how do you surface that information in a way that people actually understand what your team are actually busy doing. And I think all that you can do to surface that is making sure that you're making yourself visible, making the team visible in the business, making sure that if you've got the opportunity to speak at a team or business all hands, that you're doing that when the business is up at an all hands talking about some major project or product they've just delivered, making sure that also mentioning the lawyer that was involved as well. Certainly, that's something I've often had to prompt people to do. You get this photographs of all the people that were involved, and no one thought about the lawyer who probably spent many nights kind of boring through things. So yeah, just prompting, and people don't do that in a malicious way, but just making sure that when that does happen, that you're prompting people to say, yeah, next time can you make sure that you're mentioning the lawyers, making sure they get that visibility.
Stephanie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think again, it's another one that made me smile, because it is very difficult to draw a straight line in that way. I think the only thing I'd add is that as well as sort of number of products and that kind of thing, I think you also have to bear in mind complexity and likelihood of, there's a business risk appetite and how likely are they to want to engage with legal versus, what is your, the long-term planning point. Are you planning to move more to self-service? If so, it doesn't make sense to be planning on hiring loads more lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
What are you trying to achieve with the legal team? What's the relationship you're trying to take forward with the business? And if you're trying to move to a business partnering model, where, as Sam said, you have sort of vertical structure, then you need to sort of draw your lines more based on where those different business lines are going, rather than in a vacuum what the legal team looks like based on the whole of the company. And also, I think the other thing is that you have to be flexible, because you can have all these plans tied up with a bow, and then the next thing is that there's a external event or a global pandemic,
right, yeah,
that comes from left field. So yeah, I think you always have a plan B.
Excellent. Okay, last question. This should be a quick one. So this is really looking back at you not quite at the start of your career, but a few years ago, and then looking forward and seeing what you kind of learned in that period. So if there was one piece of advice you could give your 2017 self, with the benefit of hindsight, what would that be? And I'll come to you first, Sam.
I would say it's a difficult one. Constantly ask yourself which things you need to focus on and which things you don't need to focus on. It's a bit of a cliched answer, but the times when I look back and there's been a mistake that's been made, and I wish that I put more effort into it, or wish that I'd dedicated more resource or in the team, you do kick yourself, because you look back and you think, well, in hindsight, that was really important, that project or that email or whatever it was. And you get this, you get, when you make a mistake or something goes wrong, you obviously get feedback, and you get through it and you move on to the next thing. But I always wish that I would have maybe sat back and thought a little bit more about how I was going to approach a project or approach a matter, rather than just sort of using my instinct to just go from day to day. So I think it's those kind of moments that James was potentially talking about earlier, where on a Sunday night or on an afternoon walk, you have a bit more clarity of thought, and you're able to put in place a more medium term or long term action plan to, this is how I'm going to approach the specific issue or the specific project, and I'm going to try and make it as bulletproof as possible and make it as a massive success, because you're not constantly in firefighting mode. So I would say, it's a bit cliched, but just try and take the time out to think clearly about what you want to achieve and what you want to prioritize.
James?
Yeah, I mean, on a similar theme in some respects, I'd say focus less on making others happy and focus more on making an impact. And what I mean by that is, I think as lawyers, we tend to be people pleasers, and I think nothing makes us happier than someone thinking we did a good job. I mean, secretly, we sort of like kind of smiling inside, even though we may not show it. We like a pat on the shoulder secretly. I think we like not to kind of get away from that mindset and actually focus on the things where you can actually make the most impact, even if you're not going to get that pat on the back.
Sure, Stephanie?
I would say a similar vein, but instead of waiting to be invited into things, or assuming that the important situations will always involve the lawyers, spend some time thinking about what are the things you want to be involved in, and make that happen for yourself, because other people around the business aren't necessarily going to think for you, oh, we ought to have legal involved, or let's get the GC's view on this. You've got to anticipate that and get in there yourself if you want to have a seat at the table.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, we're all, as lawyers, a little bit reactive, aren't we? I wait for clients to ask me a question, and similarly it would be the same in-house. Well, I think we're pretty much perfectly on time. So James, Stephanie, and Sam, a huge thank you for your time and sharing your insights. It's been hopefully our audience have found it interesting, and just wrapping up and saying thank you guys so much, and goodbye to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thanks, Kolvin.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.